Welcome to the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, where our mission is to make Lyme disease easy to diagnose and simple to cure. I'm your host, Leah Gertner, Director of Education and Outreach. Lyme disease is the most common vector-borne disease in the USA and is a global issue. This show includes interviews with the researchers we fund, as well as other interesting people in the Lyme scientific community. We are a nonprofit foundation based in Silicon Valley. Thanks to a generous grant that covers all of our overhead, 100% of all donations go directly to support research and prevention programs. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org. Welcome, Dr. Horowitz. Thank you for joining me on the Ticktective podcast and video series.
My pleasure, Leah. Great to be here.
Richard Horowitz, MD, is a board-certified internist and a member of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation's advisory board, and he's the medical director of the Hudson Valley Healing Arts Center in upstate New York. He has treated over 13,000 Lyme and tick-borne disease patients during the past 30 years. He is the author of several journal publications, as well as 2 best-selling books, Why Can't I Get Better? And How Can I Get Better? An action plan for treating resistant Lyme and chronic disease. Dr. Horowitz was also a member of the U.S. Health and Human Services Tick-borne Disease Working Group and co-chair of the other Tick-borne Diseases and Co-infections Subcommittee, which provided recommendations to Congress to improve the care of those suffering with tick-borne disease. Dr. Horowitz, your popular books are considered to be instruction manuals for many people who get diagnosed with tick-borne infections, especially if they have late-stage infections or persistent infections. And I'd like you to share with our audience how you got started working in tick-borne disease in the first place.
Yeah, so, the story is actually quite interesting, Leah, because I was not planning on doing Lyme disease or infectious disease. I was an internist, a board-certified internist. And when I came back from medical school, I did my training at Mount Sinai Services in New York City. And when I finished, my mother wanted to open me up a place in Bayside, Queens to practice medicine, but Vassar Hospital had offered me a deal to come upstate. It was about 2 hours north in the Poughkeepsie area and work through Vassar Hospital. And eventually I worked at St. Francis also, and they would help me to set up a medical office. So it was 2 hours away. I could see my parents. It was, the mountains and rivers and beautiful area. And I thought, oh, great, I'll be a country doc. And little did I know, I was walking in at that time to the largest Lyme endemic area in the United States. Dutchess County, where I moved to, was extremely high at the time. And as an internist, basically, I'm a medical detective. I always like referring to my MD as, in fact, medical detective, trying to find out, of course, why people are sick. And as you know, about 70, 80% would come back with erythema migrans rashes and respond well to doxycycline or amoxicillin, but 10 to 20% did not. And roughly 30 years ago, I went on a journey to figure out why these people were not getting better. And that's why my books kind of came out. It's basically this journey of trying to help people and figure out why they stayed ill.
I know the Bay Area Lyme Foundation funded your published studies on precision medicine. And I know the studies examine patient records to look for trends on the effectiveness of different treatments, such as dapsone. And as well, it looked at the role of what you've termed multiple systemic infectious disease syndrome, or MSIDS. And you looked at modeling and defining, diagnosing, and treating Lyme and other chronic illnesses with the MSIDS model. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what multiple systemic infectious disease syndrome, or MSIDS, is all about.
Sure. So when I started seeing these Lyme patients, I started noticing that many of these patients had more than one problem, which was keeping them ill. So for example, they didn't just have Borrelia burgdorferi or Lyme disease, but I had discovered about 20 years ago that babesiosis, a tick-borne parasite, was in our community. The first case was a woman in a wheelchair who couldn't get up. She was paralyzed for 5 years and getting ongoing Lyme treatment. And within 10 days of using Mepron and Zithromax, which is a classic babesia regimen, she got up and walked. And every couple of years, I was discovering new things to help patients. So after that, we discovered Bartonella. And then we discovered, for example, that some people had low blood pressure called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or dysautonomia, where the Lyme affected the autonomic nervous system, the part of the body that controls your blood pressure, your pulse, your gastrointestinal tract, your bladder. So we just kept going and going, and every few years would discover these new things like heavy metals, mold toxins. So that is how the MSIDS model got developed. is we found that there were multiple causes of inflammation that was causing a lot of these symptoms in patients, that it wasn't all Lyme. For example, about 20% of my patients, I would chelate the heavy metals, get rid of them, and they would say that their fatigue, their headaches, their joint pain, muscle pain, memory, concentration problems would all get better. So this 16-point MSIDS mop was developed over the last 30 years. And every time I found a new factor that was keeping people sick, which usually were inflammatory processes with downstream effects, I added it to the model. And we found that it's a very good comprehensive model for tracking patients and trying to figure out why people are not getting better. And the BAL study that you funded, and of course, thank you so much for that, because it was a lot of work to do that study. I had to go through 657 volumes of records of 200 patients. It took me months to do this. And we extracted from all of these volumes, all 16 points on the MSIDS model, which I had reported in my books, but I had never published in a medical journal. So it was great that I finally was able to quantify this very specifically as far as what we found in patients.
And can you give me a little summary? I've read your publication and I know it's quite extensive, but some of the trends that were highlighted and still stand out to you after you've published several more publications since then, what stands out for you?
So there's quite a few things that stand out. The first is that the antibody testing for Lyme basically did not work. We found very low levels of ELISAs and C6 ELISAs in that study. We found that around 45% of our patients had positive IgM Western blots, which were CDC positive, 2341, 3941, 2339, any combination. And there'd been I would say, controversy in the medical literature for quite a while that IgM Western blots either were false positive if they were found in chronically ill patients, or they only represented early disease. Well, our study basically showed that, in fact, they were more common in people with chronic Lyme, and it fills kind of in the gaps that Nicole Baumgarth was showing in the mice, where when Borrelia invades the body, the lymph nodes get affected, and the B cells basically do not produce antibodies the same way, so that the IgG antibodies go down and the IgM antibodies go up. So that was a major factor. We also found that the patients who had chronic Lyme in our study, less than 20% had erythema migrans rashes, not the 70 or 80% that is sometimes described in the literature. We found persistence of Lyme, Borrelia burgdorferi, persistence of babesiosis despite antibiotics like clindamycin quinine and Mepron azithromax, persistence of Bartonella, persistence of mycoplasma species like Mycoplasma fermentans, a lot of inflammation. About 70% had inflammatory markers. Over 70% had immune deficiency, where they had subclass deficiencies or chronic variable immune deficiency. Over 80% had heavy metals. Roughly 70% had mold toxins. We found a lot with food allergies. 80% had some form of allergies. And then almost 100% had sleep disorders, neurocognitive deficits, neuropsychiatric issues. A fair amount had liver function abnormalities. So it turned out that on the MSIDS model, roughly, we found at least that of these 16 points, 70% of the people roughly had multiple factors on the MSIDS map. The POTS was around 40%. It was low, and mitochondrial dysfunction was even less. But the problem with quantifying mitochondrial dysfunction, the mitochondria, the part of the body that makes energy and are needed for neurological functioning and energy, we gave them CoQ10, NT factors, acetyl L-carnitine, but these people had already responded to dapsone combination therapy. So it was very difficult to tell in the subpopulation how much these nutritional supplements that support the mitochondria were actually helping. So the key for people is, it's kind of the analogy I use is, a patient goes into a doctor's office with 16 nails in the foot and says, "Doc, I'm having foot pain." And the doctor only pulls out one nail and has them come back a month later and they still have pain. Most of the patients I've seen with chronic Lyme PTLDS at this point have multiple factors. And I would say the big ones are chronic persistent Lyme, chronic persistent Babesia, chronic persistent Bartonella, sometimes Mycoplasma, lots of environmental toxins, detoxification problems, autoimmune problems definitely overlap quite a few, sleep disorders, so even microbiome issues that turned out in some. So for people who are suffering, the answer is, you can take this 16-point model and go through it very carefully with your healthcare provider. For example, 70, 80% had adrenal issues. Now, if you're giving antibiotics or herbs and you're still tired, we found that the adrenal was playing a big role. And a lot of our men had low testosterone, 200s, 300s, where normally it should have been 8 or 900. So the key is go through the model if you're still sick with your healthcare provider, and you may find that there were multiple overlapping factors that were keeping you ill.
I know that that was a very correlative study. You looked at all the things that sort of came together. And I know that we don't have any answers yet, although there are researchers working on this. But do you feel like instinctively it's probably a pathogen that then compromises the immune system and makes them susceptible to all these other issues?
I do think that Lyme makes them more susceptible. Absolutely. I have no doubt about it. The rule of thumb at this point is patients are multiply co-infected. But the thing that was interesting in the precision medicine studies that BAL had sponsored is that this was the first time that we took a large subset of patients who did dapsone combination therapy, which was doxycycline, rifampin with dapsone, sometimes with azithromycin, sometimes with a cephalosporin like cefuroxymaxatil. And this was the first time we were able to quantify that 8 major Lyme symptoms improved statistically with p-values less than 0.001, where their fatigue got better, headaches got better, memory concentration got better, sleep got better, joint pain, muscle pain, neuropathy got better. So it was a very telling story that dapsone combination therapy was helping people who had failed prior antibiotic therapy. And we just published a new article yesterday on dapsone, culture studies on dapsone in combination with other intracellular antibiotics, because all the studies that I had done up until now, which was about 300 patients retrospectively on dapsone combination therapy, we did not have a culture study to say why dapsone and these combination antibiotics worked. And just yesterday in Springer BMC, we published an article with Dr. Eva Shoppe and her students at the University of New Haven with my colleague, Dr. Phyllis Freeman. And we showed that dapsone was the most effective drug for the biofilm forms of Lyme. And for those people who've not been following the literature during the last several years, the persister forms of Lyme, which are in biofilms, have turned out to be, I believe, the key as to why the NIH trials did not show any long-term benefit for people using drugs like IV Rocephin, doxycycline, Viaxin, et cetera. It's because they were not addressing not only the points on the MSIDS model that were still causing inflammation, they did not look at co-infections, but they did not use any of the biofilm agents or persister drugs. They did not use dapsone, disulfiram, none of the new therapies that clinicians have been using in the last 7 or 8 years, which I'm finding is making a huge difference in helping get my patients better. So we were very excited that this culture study finally got published. It showed that dapsone combination therapy, doxy, rifampin, and dapsone was the most effective triple combination. When you added azithromycin, it only added about a 3% benefit in culture in lowering the biofilm forms, but this was in 72 hours. We found that this combination therapy was doing a good job of lowering down the biofilm. So there is hope for Lyme patients. For those who've been suffering, I think we are really starting to see some progress.
So I know that you worked on the HHS Health and Human Services Tick-borne Disease Working Group. And I'm wondering if your experience there has shed light on why there is such a slow movement forward in research for discovering new possible therapeutics for the people that don't get well off a standard course of doxycycline. What sort of insights did you have from your experience there that could help inform people what they could do as patients or scientists or researchers or funders to try to propel the science forward for those who are still suffering?
So it's a great question. And I actually did learn a lot from being on the HHS Tick-borne Working Group. And I've actually continued on their subcommittees with the Babesia and other tick-borne pathogens. And so first thing that I learned is that a lot of these people who work at the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, Department of Defense, these are very well-motivated people who are looking for answers. But unfortunately, what I found is that they're a bit mired in the controversies themselves. So the CDC, for example, had been relying on these several NIH double-blind randomized controlled trials, and there had been no trials that had been done in over 10 years, again, not with biofilm or persister drugs. So I think what came out of it is that we definitely needed more research on better diagnostics, that the two-tiered protocol was only working in about 56% of the patients. There were arguments with persistence that came up on the committee. Certainly, if you were to read the congressional document and the subcommittee reports, We did discuss persistence in animal studies and in humans, but because there's not been a randomized controlled trial at this point, using these newer therapies like dapsone or disulfiram, we don't really have a final answer that's going to convince the broad scientific community. So, for funders who are out there, what I think is necessary at this point is you need a double or a triple blinded randomized controlled trial using dapsone combination therapy, using disulfiram. We have actually used disulfiram and dapsone in combination. I've not reported this yet. I have another article that's in peer review right now on double dose dapsone combination therapy. So for funders and people out there, as far as how to move the needle on to get this controversy that has been mired at HHS and the CDC for years, I think really what you've got to do is do studies using biofilm and persister drugs. I have seen enough positive results in my patients at this point. I'm convinced that if you could get funding for a multi-center randomized controlled trial using the doxyrifampin dapsone combination, and I've already written out the study, I do think you would probably see results and that we could move the needle forward where patients would be able to have much more effective treatments with very short courses of antibiotics. The double dose dapsone protocol that I'm using is 8 weeks, maximum 12 weeks in some people. So it's very short. It's not IV. It's all generic. And people do okay with it if they do the proper using folic acid and glutathione and methylene blue and things you need to protect yourself from the side effects of dapsone. So the Tick-borne working group, I think, did good work, but I think their hands were tied. They were limited by the amount of research that's been out there. The second round of the Tick-borne working group, I've been following the progress closely with Pat Smith and others, Sam Donta on the group. And unfortunately, it's kind of gotten into a little bit of a brawl where people were debating, oh no, it's a religious viewpoint that Lyme persists. And in fact, yesterday, I sent the dapsone culture study to all my contacts at the federal and state level to let them know I've gotten back positive results already. These type of studies, culture studies, really hard science, I think that's how you're going to move the needle forward.
I agree. That's why the Bay Area Lyme Foundation really makes it our goal to support research, to try to have science be the final word and to affect change. So another question for you. Richard, you've seen some of your persistent tick-borne disease patients in New York affected by COVID-19, and we know that inflammatory processes are involved in both diseases and also in acute and chronic or long-haul patients. You've used therapeutics such as glutathione to treat both tick-borne diseases and COVID-19 patients, I know. I'm wondering if Lyme disease has helped inform your treatment of COVID-19. Do you think that all of the research being poured into COVID-19 could in turn help inform or improve the tick-borne disease arena, either in diagnostics or therapeutics?
Yes, absolutely. The research that I've done in Lyme in the last 30 plus years has definitely informed how I am treating COVID-19. So when the virus came out, I started looking at the medical literature very carefully. And one of the things that struck me is that the inflammatory process that was happening with COVID with inflammatory cytokines was very similar to what we were seeing with Lyme. And because we had dealt with Herxheimer reactions in Lyme patients for over 3 decades, where we were learning to block a switch inside the nucleus called NF-kappa B. This is a switch that turns on inflammation, and you will get tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1, IL-6, a lot of these inflammatory molecules come out. Well, in COVID, when I looked at the inflammatory molecules, they greatly resembled what happens with Lyme. So when I got one of my first COVID patients with shortness of breath and pneumonia, I tried them on the same dose of glutathione that I used for Herxheimer reactions, which was 2,000 milligrams. And lo and behold, within 1 hour of using glutathione, their dyspnea, their shortness of breath got better. That same patient then did IV glutathione the next day and found it was even more effective. We tried it on another patient. There's a medical student who's been training with me for years. His mom actually got sick. She had exactly the same response to glutathione. So we wrote it up in the medical literature in the Journal of Respiratory Medicine case reports. And we went through the biochemistry of how the inflammation in Lyme and COVID is similar. We followed up with a second article, which is now live this month in Medical Hypothesis, which is also in a Selvier journal, looking at 3 novel diagnostic and treatment options as well as prevention options for COVID. And in this article, I go even further than glutathione. We discuss ivermectin. Now, I had used ivermectin over the years in Lyme patients who had overlapping parasites. When you get babesiosis, this tick-borne parasitic infection, it's been shown that it can suppress your immune system's ability to get rid of other parasites. So for example, intestinal parasites can come out. We've had a lot of experience using ivermectin before COVID. When COVID came out, there were 3 studies that showed very strong positive results using ivermectin. So we've now treated about 26 patients with COVID. We've used ivermectin with doxycycline, with zinc, high-dose glutathione, 2,000 milligrams, with NAC, alpha-lipoic acid. And we found that not one of our chronic Lyme patients has ended up in the hospital. Not one has ended up on a respirator. And we've heard exactly the same story from every person. Within several hours of using ivermectin, their symptoms got better. And within 1 hour of using high-dose glutathione, the shortness of breath, the fatigue, the underlying symptoms got better. So I suspect in these COVID long haulers, these people that are still sick, there's a lot of reasons why they may still be ill. But if you looked at the 16-point MSIDS map, some of the reasons would be that you have a lot of inflammation and free radical oxidative stress, and the mitochondria in the body have nothing to protect them against this oxidative stress. So it's possible that a large number have mitochondrial dysfunction. We've seen that in fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. It's very likely that some of these people, their adrenals are low. They were stressed out from the infection and just from living on this planet. Many probably reactivated underlying infections. Some of these people have been exposed, obviously, to environmental toxins and smoke and pollutants, which also increases the inflammatory process. So I would guess if you probably use the MSIDS model, you would find reactivation of infections and environmental toxins and issues with the mitochondria, POTS dysautonomia. Many of these things would probably show up. And I hope at some point, someone with a large population of COVID patients will look at it. But it is definitely my research in Lyme that helped us define what I have at least found to be effective treatments for COVID.
And so much money and energy and effort is being poured into the COVID diagnostics program. Do you have hope that maybe it will help inform the largely neglected Lyme diagnostics world of the past half century?
I think it's going to be easier for the Lyme community to stand on the laurels of, we've been telling you for decades that the 2-tier testing is unreliable without adequate sensitivity, specificity. And here you have a pandemic, which we should have been prepared for and we weren't. And the testing that was rolled out did not have adequate sensitivity and specificity. There's problems with the antibodies. There's problems with even the PCR testing, depending on how it's done. So I do think the Lyme community has at least the ability to say, you've been telling us for years it's accurate. We know, in fact, the diagnostics are not accurate. And you've had exactly the same problem with COVID. And you could have learned from Lyme during the last 30 years, and you did not. So there are lessons that definitely need to be learned. In the past administrations, we have had pandemic responsiveness, where I know Obama talked about it and George Bush talked about it in the past. And unfortunately, we did not use a lot of the information that we had gathered over the decades in the United States to prepare for this. So I think when this is all done, the CDC and our governmental agencies are going to have to stand back and really take a hard look at what went wrong, so this would never happen again.
So you've been a bit of a medical cowboy. I mean, you're sort of running these little clinical studies in your clinic, and you're not waiting for the government to hand you the information, because as we all know, the Lyme disease research has been very scant since Lyme disease was discovered here in the US. And so some doctors like you just want your patients to get better, and you're willing to try anything. But that must be a risky spot to put yourself in, and really putting yourself on the line and speaking out. So I want to thank you for being that brave, and wondering if you have any advice for other Lyme practitioners, people who are treating these really sick patients with persistent or chronic disease. And I think it would probably apply to long haulers with COVID, because we don't have studies on the effectiveness of treatments for COVID long haulers because it's so new. So I was wondering if you could just speak to you being really a pioneer and an innovator and pretty bold in this field.
So, by the way, I didn't know that about myself when I first started medicine. I really didn't. I received advice when I came out of medical school. I went to one of my spiritual teachers in Brussels before I came back to the US. And I said to Lama Gendon Rinpoche, I said, Lama, can you please tell me what is the most important thing in medicine you need me to know before I go out into the world and help people? And he said, Richard, the most important thing is put yourself in people's shoes and do for them what you would want done. Just have compassion and everything will go well. Now, if you ever study with Tibetan Buddhist lamas, you'll know they always talk about loving kindness and compassion, but it's not just words. It's actually like, we'll put it into action. And when I started seeing these chronically ill patients in Dutchess County, New York, who weren't getting better, I thought back to the advice of my teacher and said, well, gee, if I was sick or my wife was sick or family members, I wouldn't want to get to the source of it. In fact, I would think all doctors would. But what I did is basically take that advice and just go to the literature, started reading articles. I went to the Lyme disease conferences. I was a bit naive at the time when I did start in Lyme because I did not know about the controversies between the IDSA and ultimately ILADS, of which I was a founding member. But over time, what I did to protect myself and help other doctors is publish. And I think if you're going to try something new, it's got to obviously based on peer review science that's out there. And there has, fortunately, and a lot of this, by the way, has been thanks to Bay Area Lyme, as well as research at Stanford and the University of New Haven and Kim Lewis at Northeastern. The last 7 or 8 years, because of funding from people like Bay Area Lyme and the Cohen Foundation, has allowed me to learn about biofilms and persister forms. Up until that point, I was using a lot of the standard treatments that everyone was using. And even though I had tried different combinations, they only went so far. So what I would say to doctors who are interested in helping their patients is go to the MSIDS model, see what you can find, publish the results, stay on top of the literature because there is a lot that's coming out. But I really think that the answer at this point, we have it, we're right at the cusp. It is biofilms and persisters and multiple abnormalities on the MSIDS model. That is what this is coming to. And this is what I believe is going to be the problem with the COVID long haulers, because as you said, since it's a new disease and we don't have any way of kind of finding out why these people are sick, this is a screening model, the MSIDS model, to look for chronic illness. What are the multiple causes of inflammation, whether it's multiple infections, bacterial, viral, parasitic, candida or mold? Are there microbiome abnormalities? Is there autoimmunity, environmental toxins that are getting in? And then downstream effects affecting your pituitary and hormones or mitochondria or autonomic nervous system. It's a model that can be applied really to any chronic illness. And in the future, I mean, one of the things I would love to do as time goes on is 86% of the healthcare costs in this country are due to chronic disease, and 70% of the deaths in this country are due to chronic disease. And we do not have a model, a broad-based model to address chronic disease. In my opinion, the MSIDS model could be used for it. And I would love to see someone who has a large number of patients with COVID apply the model, because I think you're going to find a lot of useful information that will help these patients.
Great, thank you. So my last question is your advice to potential patients or people who don't want to become patients. So I know right now I'm inhaling a lot of smoke from burning buildings here in California, and I know that it's not good for my health, but I don't have a choice. You know, I eat as well as I can, I exercise. We don't have control over all of our toxic inputs. And so I'm wondering if there's a regimen that you recommend as a general guideline. I know everyone is an N of one and an individual and has different genetics and different hormones and so many different supplement needs that are very individual. But is there any general guidelines that you could give to people to try to stay healthy?
Yes, absolutely. So as you said, I mean, diet, exercise, and sleep, right? Those are, of course, very, very important for staying healthy. In the case of being exposed to large amounts of environmental pollutants, in both of my books, I have a chapter on Lyme and environmental toxins and Lyme and functional medicine with detoxification. So those two chapters, for those people who really want to learn about what to do, I would suggest going to those two chapters. But let me give you just an overview of what we've been telling people, both for prevention of COVID and treatment. And these also will help to detoxify a lot of the chemicals, because we know from 9/11, the people that were exposed in New York City to that dust and all of the chemicals that were there, they're now seeing large amounts of cancer that is showing up. I spoke to Ben Luft about this a while ago, who's been tracking these people. There's a lot of dementia. People who get small particle pollution, which is what's happening with the smoke and the pollutants. That is known cause of dementia and Alzheimer's. So what I would suggest to people, apart from closing the windows, getting air purifiers with HEPA filters, I saw a video recently on using a fan. If you can't get the air filters, a fan with HEPA filters, with the HEPA actually in the other direction, blowing the air to help you in your space where you're breathing the air. But if you can't get a respirator mask, which are almost unavailable at this point, the most important thing is to help your body deal with the inflammation and help support detoxification. So detoxification is the liver pathways, it's the skin, it's the bowels, it's the kidneys. So you want to drink at least 2 liters of fluid a day, because dilution is the solution to pollution. Now, I didn't make that up. That's Sherry Rogers, right? If you've got saunas, definitely start using far infrared saunas, 15, 20 minutes every other day. Drinking a lot, of course, and replacing minerals, because you'll sweat the toxins very effectively through the skin. You can use binders for the bowel. You can use, whether it's Metamucil, something simple, fiber, or clay charcoal compounds, which will help pull it from the enterohepatic circulation. But with the liver, what I'm suggesting for most people for phase 1, phase 2 liver pathways are things like milk thistle, NAC, alpha lipoic acid, and glutathione, which blocks NF-kappa B, lowers the inflammatory cytokines in Lyme and in COVID, and glutathione removes fat-soluble toxins from the body. So I would suggest in general 600 milligrams of N-acetylcysteine twice a day minimum. People living in smoke-infested areas like you're living, probably even 1,200 of NAC twice a day. Alpha lipoic acid minimum 300 milligrams twice a day, going up to 600 twice a day if you don't have reactive hypoglycemia, because a small percentage of people will get it. Glutathione, where you're living, probably at least 500 milligrams twice a day, 1,000 a day. That's what I take, also for prevention of COVID, because glutathione and NAC have antiviral properties. They also have antithrombotic properties, as well as treating some of the inflammatory response with COVID. So if you do NAC, alpha lipoic acid, and glutathione, you're helping your body to get rid of all these pollutants getting in. And if you use another pathway called the NRF2 pathway, which is a pathway that lowers inflammation, because all of the smoke and pollutants are going to drive inflammation in the body, making any underlying disease worse, that can be accomplished with several nutritional supplements like turmeric, curcumin, at least 1,000 milligrams twice a day. My favorite is broccoli seed extract, sulforaphane glucosinolate. It's the most potent phase 2 liver detoxifier. They found it to be useful at Johns Hopkins, even for autistic children, at 300 milligrams a day. You can also use green tea extract as long as it's organic, and finally using resveratrol. So I take personally all of these to lower inflammation, because inflammation is the #1 common denominator for all chronic disease. So go to those 2 chapters in my books, use the things that detoxify the body, flush the system. I think if people were to do that on a regular basis, you would be protecting yourself from the long-term consequences of this. And hopefully this is not going to obviously last forever, but my concern with the climate is I started writing a book on climate change the year before when no one was talking about it. And now, of course, everyone's talking about it, because we're not only seeing the fires in California, but we're seeing them in the Amazon, in other forests in Brazil. We're seeing it in Russia with heat waves. We're seeing it in the Arctic. So the climate is finally starting to unfold, the climate problems. This is not going to be the first time you're going to be exposed to smoke and wildfires. And I think people need to get used to the idea that whatever your life was beforehand, you should start educating yourself on the climate, how the world is going to change, and how to protect yourself. And I've been doing a lot of research for years, and I hope to have a new book out sometime next year to help people.
Well, thank you for being an activist on so many fronts: climate change, Lyme, COVID. And we really appreciate having a hero out there working on our behalf. So thank you very much for joining me today on the Ticktective video and podcast series. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you, Leah. And again, thank you to Bay Area Lyme and to all the wonderful people. You guys rock. I mean, you guys are really great. You've done so much to help the Lyme community. So just thank you so much from both physicians and for patients for everything that you're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay. Have a good one.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Ticktective podcast and video series, a program of the Bay Area Lyme Foundation. You can find out more or donate at bayarealyme.org.